Heraclitus is focused on wisdom in the Fragments, and the word sophos, which is wisdom in Greek, appears 13 times in the Fragments. And he goes on to describe wisdom as, and I quote, "Wisdom is the oneness of mind that guides and permeates all things." And this journey to finding wisdom is the cultivation of virtue. You cannot attain, you cannot see the ultimate reality. You cannot see what it is that is behind all of this if you haven't cultivated virtue, if you haven't integrated the wisdom into your own life. And so Heraclitus writes, "To be even-minded is the greatest virtue. Wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with its nature." This is the key which repeats over and over again. Wisdom is the oneness of action and thought, to ultimately be doing and not doing, to act without action. And Lao Tzu calls this Wu Wei. And the problem is, and many of us think that we understand wisdom. Many of us think that we have understood God because we believe in God. And many of us think that God doesn't exist because there's no evidence for it. Both sides for Heraclitus are mistaken. He makes fun of religious people in the Fragments and also makes fun of other philosophers in the Fragments. But one of the points that Heraclitus emphasizes is, if you claim to have wisdom but your actions don't align with the wisdom, that you obviously are a fool. You don't have wisdom. And so Heraclitus writes, "Many who have learned from Hesiod the countless names of gods and monsters never understand that night and day are one." And what he's saying here about night and day is, again, harking back to the oneness of all things, right? This sort of monistic idea that all is one, that fundamentally there's a unity that underlies the multiplicity and perhaps even removes all the multiplicities. I hope you're enjoying the podcast. And if you are, please consider signing up and supporting my work on Substack or Patreon by clicking the link in the description, and help me get this in front of like-minded people by sharing it with your friends and family. And leave a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, or subscribe with the bell if you're on YouTube. Let's get into it. When the iron hoe was a new invention, Pythagoras saw mathematical logic as a language of cosmic prophecy. Now, when we say E equals mc squared, we are stating in mathematical terms the thought of Pythagoras' contemporary, Heraclitus, who said that energy is the essence of matter. Heraclitus puts it in the ancient Greek this way: "All things change to fire, and fire exhausted falls back into things." Einstein agreed. For him, the earth, the sun, and the moon and stars, the wind and waters, everything became energy in flux, in relativity, and the world was staggered by mental shock, then by physical explosion. But the wisdom of Heraclitus held true 2,500 years after his death. Heir to the throne of Ephesus, one of the world's richest, most powerful cities, Heraclitus gave up the kingdom and chose, instead of the trappings of power, to seek the word of wisdom. His writings survived the Persian Empire, dominant in his time, and then Greek and Roman. For hundreds of years, great writers, Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, and others, quoted him with respect. Then his book, with thousands of the finest works of that world, disappeared forever. Scholars describe this lost book as the first coherent philosophical treatise. But the existing fragments resembled prophecy and poetry as much as they do philosophical discourse. After all, philosophy had just begun. Pythagoras had only lately coined the word philosopher, meaning lover of wisdom. But the pursuit of wisdom is much older than Pythagoras or his word for himself as a serious student. That is an excerpt by the translator Brooks Haxton, whose copy of Fragments that I own. Fragments is a collection of quotes and passages attributed to the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus between 535 to 475 BC. These fragments are the remaining works of his original book called On Nature, which has been lost. And that single book on nature, we are told by other philosophers that it was divided into three parts: the universe, politics, and theology. Heraclitus is referenced by other Greek philosophers, by Plato, by Aristotle, but we don't actually have this book, and we only have these fragments in the modern world. And as Haxon mentioned in the excerpt, Heraclitus inherited a kingdom. They wanted to make him king, but he rejected it. He rejected this glory of being a king because he instead wanted to pursue wisdom. He wanted to understand the nature of reality. He wanted to be in constant union with this wisdom that we read in the fragments. And Heraclitus is best known for his doctrine that things are in constant flux. They're constantly changing, and that there is a harmony found between opposites. Right? There's a unity that exists within these opposites. And he's famous for this idea that you can never step into the same river twice, because the river has changed, and you, the person stepping into the river, has also changed. And so neither the river nor you are the same. And so I quote from the fragments, "Just as the river where I step is not the same, and is, so I am as I am not." What he's saying here, there is a constant changing occurring in the river and also in you. Right? You, from this moment to the next moment, are not the same person, and the river, the water, has already gone through it in which you first stepped into it. And if we zoom out a bit more from the river and from yourself, we realize that all of the things in this cosmos, everything is in this constant state of flux. Everything is changing. And that's why he says, air dies giving birth to fire, fire dies giving birth to air, water thus is born of dying earth, and earth of water. If Heraclitus is right, that everything is changing, there's actually something good that comes out from it. And it is that it liberates us from our materialistic mindset, our attachment to this world, to possession, to all these things, to status, just as Heraclitus rejected his title as king. When you see that all is changing, when you see that all is flux, you are able to break free from being attached to this world. And this idea of not being attached, we've talked about in the episode with Buddha and Lao Tzu as well. One of the key lessons from Buddha is that the suffering that you and I endure and the suffering that happens to us is the result of our desires, is the result of our attachments. And so what we must do is become detached. But embedded in this is not this idea that you no longer care for the people, you no longer care for the world. It's instead that you can see that all is connected, and you can see that all is changing, and in this state that ultimately you are fully attached, you are fully engaged in this world, that you become detached to the outcomes. And this is similar to what Heraclitus here is saying. And in this way, we become more adaptable, and we're willing to embrace change within our own lives, because we aren't afraid of what might happen in the future, because we know. Because no matter what happens, we know that what will happen is part of the drama of this cosmos. Heraclitus is often approached in a very academic, in a very dry way, in trying to decipher whether Heraclitus meant, that everything was in change, or that he ultimately meant everything was permanent. It's always approached from the scholarly academic standpoint. But I think the deeper point that Heraclitus is making, and he states it quite obviously, that he's openly telling you the secrets about the world, about the cosmos, about reality. But just because you hear it doesn't mean that you understand it. And secondly, it also doesn't mean that you actually perceive what it is saying. And so in the opening, the first fragment, Heraclitus writes, "The word proves those first hearing it as numb to understanding as the ones who have not heard. Yet all things follow from the word. Some, blundering with what I have set before you, try in vain with empty talk to separate the essence of things and say how each thing truly is, and all the rest make no attempt. They no more see how they behave broad waking than remember clearly what they did asleep." What he means here is that not everybody's going to understand what he's saying. Even those who are trying to decipher the nuances of Heraclitus, they themselves are confusing themselves. right? They're digging deeper and deeper holes into which they cannot pull themselves out of. Heraclitus here is telling us he is putting everything that he knows up front. Obviously, what we have are just fragments, but he's saying, look, everything that I know is up front. Here, the secrets that I've uncovered, but some of you are not going to understand this. And that opening reminds me of a story about the Buddha. When he reaches enlightenment, attained enlightenment, he's become the Buddha. He's awakened. And he's under the Bodhi tree. In that state, Mara appears to him. Mara is the evil one. By the way, if you haven't listened to that episode on the Buddha, check that one out. Now, Mara says to him, you might as well stop right here. You've attained enlightenment. You've awakened and you see reality as is. You might as well from here depart from this life because nobody else is going to understand your teaching. There is no point in you setting forth your idea, setting forth your teachings. And there's no point in you having students because your students are not going to understand, Siddhartha. Let it go. Leave this world behind. And the story goes, Buddha was on the verge of accepting the fate that Mara had just set before him. But in that moment, just as he's about to give up, says to Mara, it is true that not everybody whom I teach will understand, but there will be some. And through my teaching, some will awaken. And that alone is enough. And so Buddha goes forth and teaches. And in a similar way, Heraclitus here is doing the same thing, except with Heraclitus, there's no Heraclitean school that comes after that has existed to this day, whereas with the Buddha, there are whole traditions and religions that have come out of the Buddha's teaching. So keep this in mind about Heraclitus' teaching and what he's trying to tell us. The other thing about Heraclitus' teaching in this idea of flux is if we accept what he says, then it becomes easier to see the challenges that happen to us, right? Whatever happens to us, we don't see it as a setback, but we can perceive it as part of the process of this life, of our life particularly. And we see that no matter what happens, no matter the struggles that we face, we're not discouraged and we're not hopeless, because we can perceive and understand that there is a rhythm, there's this eternal drama that's taking place that is greater than us. And through that, we're able to find peace in the ambiguity of life. And this is key here. Many of us struggle with ambiguity generally. We don't like to be in the unknown. We like to know things for certain. We like everything to be clear cut with sharp edges. We don't like things that are a bit unclear, a bit circular. But the truth is, as Heraclitus claims, right, nothing in our lives are certain, not even our waking tomorrow. You and I could close our eyes tonight and not wake up tomorrow. It's unlikely, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities, right? How many people do we know that have suddenly passed away? They were healthy, young, fit, whether that was in a car accident, a heart attack, sudden stage 4 brain cancer. These things happen, right? These things that we think are improbable, they happen to us because nothing about our life is certain. Not even our waking up is certain. And that make us pause for a second and make us reflect on the things that Heraclitus is teaching. He's teaching that there's this cycle, this ongoing eternal cycle, and we see this eternal drama, this cycle that takes place on a cosmic level. It's visible in our day-to-day experience. Right? We have fall, winter, spring, summer. Each one is different. Each one has its time, its place, but the whole cycle repeats over and over again every year. We have this idea of a man and woman get together, the woman gets pregnant, and she gives birth to a new child, and this child grows up, repeats, gets together, gets pregnant, gives birth, And there's a cycle of life and death that all of us are playing out. Now, we are the result of this cycle that has gone back thousands and thousands of years. And Heraclitus is saying, this microcosmic eternal cycle that you're seeing in the season, that you're seeing in your own life, is happening on a grand cosmic scale. And just being able to understand that, right? Understand this eternal flux allows you to live in peace and find serenity in the ambiguity of life. And most importantly, to not identify yourself with a particular instance in your life. So if you're going through something difficult, right? If we are struggling with some sort of tragedy, to not identify with this tragedy as if that defines fully and only us. Or if you're at the highest point in your life, if you won the Olympic gold medal, to not identify yourself with that particular instance, with that particular moment, and to see instead that all of it is ephemeral, is not eternal. It's like when we're standing on a beach and you're looking out into the ocean, what do you see? You see waves crashing upon the beach. You see the froth rising on top of the waves, the bubbles. You see the rippling in the water. Right? The ocean is constantly moving. Yet in that movement, there is an existent stillness. And it is these two things that we call the ocean. So we're both like the waves on the surface and the ocean itself. The key is not to identify yourself with the surface, right? The waves or the froth or the bubbles that happen, but to see that you are the water, the substance, the ocean itself. The flux, the changes we experience in our lives is the impermanence, right? Is that which is ephemeral. And it is seeing this truth that frees us from the bondage of clinging to the impermanence, to the materiality of this world. And that is what Heraclitus is trying to convey to those who are reading his works. And so then if we can view past the impermanence, one of the results is that you are able to exist in the present moment, because now you embrace the whole process. The whole process of life becomes this one thing. There is no end goal. There is no outcome that you're trying to attain. And understanding that all is flux shifts your focus from end goals to become more outcome oriented, to see that the process is the goal itself. And so in our lives, we don't chase after goals. Not that you shouldn't have goals. You should have goals. But the goals are no longer the focus. The focus is the process. And in this sense, in a very real sense, your life becomes like that of a craftsman. And you start to view it as a craft, the whole life. Similar to meditation. A lot of people have meditation apps. A lot of people like to say that, oh, I've meditated every day for the past year, so on and so forth. And they like to brag about this thing. But the point of meditation is not that you meditate every day for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. The point of meditation is that your whole life ends up becoming the meditation. That there's no longer a distinction between meditating and living out life. That is the goal of meditation. And that is what Heraclitus here is trying to get at. It is that the whole point of life, the whole point of living is the process of accepting that this existence is an eternal drama of becoming and unbecoming, of unfolding and folding. And in chapter 4 of the Gita on knowledge, verse 18, Krishna says to Arjuna, a man who sees inaction in action and action in inaction has understanding among men, disciplined in all action he performs. And then in chapter 5, Krishna goes on to explain to Arjuna that he should get to a state where he renounces action, that he becomes detached from his actions. And that is true enlightenment. And not surprisingly, Heraclitus' philosophy gets us to the same conclusion as that we find in the Bhagavad Gita. Heraclitus is focused on wisdom in the Fragments, and the word sophos, which is wisdom in Greek, appears 13 times in the Fragments. And he goes on to describe wisdom as, and I quote, wisdom is the oneness of mind that guides and permeates all things. This sense of wisdom as that which permeates all reality, ultimately unites all things. And this is found in Eastern tradition. And we've seen the works of Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha. All of them speak about this thing. All of them speak about this one thing that is stitched into the fabric of reality, that unites all things and makes all things one, that it unites the multiplicity found in the world. The thing that I find fascinating is, like all wisdom tradition and all wisdom literature, the more you learn and apply the teachings that's found in these works, the deeper the wisdom grows. And when you reread their works again, you find new insights, new ideas and wisdom that you previously missed or you previously could not see because you hadn't cultivated the eye to see it, right? It's this cyclical, eternal movement. Again, harking back to this idea of Heraclitus that everything is in flux, but also everything is permanent. And we'll get to that in a bit. And so Heraclitus in another fragment writes, "The oneness of all wisdom may be found or not under the name of God." And by God, he doesn't mean a being among being, but he's referring to the ultimate reality, the one, the existence itself. Ipsum esse substantiis, right? He's speaking about that thing that you cannot speak about, where words fail, right? There's a English mystical work from the 14th century called The Cloud of Unknowing, and one of the points that this anonymous author says is, we have to get past the cloud of ignorance to get to this cloud of unknowing. And this cloud of unknowing is where God exists. And it's unknowing because our words fail. There's nothing that we have, concepts that we have that can grasp onto this thing. Hence why Heraclitus here says, the oneness of all wisdom may be found or not under the name of God. And he says, may be or not be found under the name of God, precisely because it is beyond the names of God that we have. When you grasp it is probably not the right word here. When you can attain to it, when you perceive it, and you can go past the veil of ignorance, the cloud of ignorance, and when you can annihilate your ego and you walk the path of itlaq or fanna, as the Sufis teach, then you'll see that everything is one, that wisdom is the oneness of mind that guides and permeates all things. Right? It is that which will be found under the name of God or not under the name of God. And this journey to finding wisdom is, again, the cultivation of virtue. You cannot attain, you cannot see the ultimate reality. You cannot see what it is that is behind all of this if you haven't cultivated virtue, if you haven't integrated the wisdom into your own life. And so Heraclitus writes, to be even-minded is the greatest virtue. Wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with its nature. This is the key which repeats over and over again. Wisdom is the oneness of action and thought, to ultimately be doing and not doing, to act without action. And Lao Tzu calls this Wu Wei, right? And the problem is, many people and many of us think that we understand wisdom. Many of us think that we have understood God because we believe in God. And many of us think that God doesn't exist because there's no evidence for it. Both sides for Heraclitus are mistaken. He makes fun of religious people in the Fragments and also makes fun of other philosophers in the Fragments. But one of the points that Heraclitus emphasizes is, if you claim to have wisdom, but your actions don't align with the wisdom, that you obviously are a fool. You don't have wisdom. And so Heraclitus writes, many who have learned from Hesiod the countless names of gods and monsters never understand that night and day are one. And what he's saying here about night and day is, again, harking back to the oneness of all things, right? This sort of monistic idea that all is one, that fundamentally there's a unity that underlies the multiplicity and perhaps even removes all the multiplicities. If you've read the work of Adi Shankara, who is a 7th century Indian philosopher, you'll see quite a tremendous amount of similarities between Heraclitus' work and Adi Shankara's, his book, The Crest Jewel of Discrimination, where Adi Shankara goes on to say that all this multiplicity that you think you perceive are actually not different from one another. They're ultimately the same thing. They're all Brahman. He goes on to talk about how you can have a bowl made of clay, a cup made of clay, a plate made of clay. And those are all different things. So, one's a plate, one's a cup, one's a bowl. But the underlying substance is clay, and that is the same thing. And Heraclitus here is emphasizing the same thing here when he's talking about many who have learned from Hesiod the countless names of gods and monsters never understand that night and day are one. They are one. Night and day are one. The other point is he's taking jabs and taking shots at the learned, the scholars, the academics. He's very skeptical of experts and specialists because, as I mentioned earlier, they often claim to have wisdom, but in reality, they are fools. Why? Because their lives don't match with their conviction. You could be an academic who says, oh, I believe in X, Y, Z, but their life, right, the way they live it out in the universities, in their family life, in their social life is very, very different. They could say, I don't believe in God, but then when they get sick, when their wife is sick, when their child is suffering from cancer, they fall on their knees and they pray. Or you could have the opposite, where somebody claims to believe in God publicly, right? They go to church, they go to the temple, they pray when they're supposed to pray. But then when you ask them whether they actually believe in what they're doing, they'll say, no, I don't. I'm simply doing it because now I work at a religious institution and I have to keep this image up. Otherwise, they'll find out I'm a fraud. So then they keep up this fraudulent image of themselves. And so for Heraclitus, these people are fools. These people are filled with vices. They don't have the virtue that he wants. They don't have the virtue which will allow them to transcend their ego, to transcend themselves, to become one with this wisdom. A side point here is that if you look at history, I think one of the most powerful ways to psychologically break a human being is by making them act against their conviction. And the opposite is also true, right? People tend to become psychologically strong when they can act in line with their conviction. And here's where Heraclitus's wisdom becomes important. He doesn't say just having conviction is virtuous, because your convictions could be filled with evil intent, with bad intent. And so he says, to be even-minded is the greatest virtue. Wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with this nature. Meaning, the wisdom you have should be in line with truth and in keeping with nature. If your convictions are opposed to nature, then in Heraclitus' eyes, you are not living in accord with nature. And secondly, you don't have wisdom. And third, your convictions are misguided. And I want to read one more quote from Heraclitus on wisdom. Of all the words yet spoken, none comes quite as far as wisdom, which is the action of the mind beyond all things that may be said. So, to do this, to live in accord and in line with your conviction, and to build this conviction, and convictions which are virtuous, you must know yourself. You have to discover who you are, the true self, not the ephemeral one going through the motion in this life. Right? That's waking up and sleeping, that's remembering things, that's forming new memories. There is this eternal self, which Adi Shankara calls the Atman, that you have to come to see. And that's why Heraclitus goes on to say, the soul is undiscovered, though explored forever to a depth beyond report. You can explore your soul forever, which means infinitely, eternally, precisely because that self, that soul within you is eternal. It is the Atman. This eternal self, this eternal soul that can be explored forever and whose depths cannot be reported. And that's beyond words, that's beyond concepts, that's beyond the finite language that we have, is the one that you have right now, that you had yesterday, that you had 10 years ago, that you had 20 years ago, that you had 30, 40 years ago, that you had 60 years ago, that you had in your mother's womb, that you had at the point of conception. That is the eternal self that the Heraclitus says is undiscovered. But when you discover it, when you learn, when you know yourself, then you will have wisdom. That's precisely why he goes on to say, applicants for wisdom, do what I have done. Inquire within. I read that again. Applicants for wisdom, people who are seeking wisdom, do as what I have done. Do exactly as I have done. Follow how I have come to attain this wisdom. And the way that I've come to attain this wisdom, Heraclitus says, is by inquiring within, is by going within, is by knowing myself, is by understanding my true nature. This soul which is undiscovered can be sought after, can be explored forever. And when you have done this, then, he writes, since mindfulness of all things is the ground of being, to speak one's true mind and to keep things known in common, serves all being, just as laws made clear uphold the city, yet with greater strength. Of all pronouncements of the law, the one source is the word whereby we choose what helps true mindfulness prevail. When you have come to see and when you have come to know yourself, when you have dove into this eternal self and found wisdom, Heraclitus is saying, make it known, live with conviction, and that conviction speak the truth with one true mind. Do not go back and forth between vice and virtue. Speak it and have conviction and make it known to the public, make it known to the world, and let that wisdom serve all things, all the creatures, just as laws are created to serve the city and to uphold the lawfulness of the city, of the people. You must do this yourself. And here, Heraclitus is actually not being an elitist by saying this, even though you'll remember from the opening, he is an elitist, insofar as he says, I am telling you the truth, but you will not understand. Some of you will not understand, some of you will understand. But I think more importantly, Heraclitus, in this sense, is not an elitist. Even though he's an elitist when it comes to politics, when it comes to wisdom, he is not. He's telling us to not hoard wisdom, to teach it to all, even though he admits that not everyone will understand this profound truth. We must share it to help people wake up, to help people climb out of the darkness of the cave, and to see that reality is not the shadow that they and we have been perceiving in the cave, but reality is actually much more colorful, much brighter, much more tangible, much realer. And one of the main points of this reality, when you see it as Heraclitus saw it, is that there is this harmony which exists between opposites. He writes, the sea is both pure and tainted, healthy and good haven, to the fish, to men, importable and deadly. We in our caves, those of us who don't have the wisdom to see this, we perceive things as bad when it happens to us. But from Heraclitus' standpoint, just because something bad happens to you doesn't mean that it's actually bad for you or that it shouldn't exist. There are tragedies which happen to us. And in those moments, we wish and we pray that it never happened to us, because the pain and the suffering feels overwhelming. And we wonder whether we'll make it out alive, whether we'll survive this whole thing. But for Heraclitus, he says, and I'm quoting, always having what we want may not be the best good fortune. Health seems sweetest after sickness, food and hunger, goodness in the wake of evil, and at the end of day-long labor, sleep. We must remember that despite the suffering that we're entrenched in, there is this silver lining, there's this hope, because as Heraclitus says, it is only in our sickness, or it is only after our sickness, that we come to appreciate good health, and we come to see that health is good for us and that it is beautiful for us. If you remember the last time you were sick, the only thing you wanted when you were sick, when you have a fever that's over 40, is to get well. You don't want more things, right? You don't want more possessions. You don't want more status. You don't want more friends. You don't want anything else other than getting better, other than your health back. And that is the point that Heraclitus is making. Do not let the tragedies, do not let what you think is bad cloud your judgment about the reality of this world. And the reality is you need this opposite, this bad, this sort of suffering, this pain to help you see the good in things. Since for Heraclitus, there's a harmony between the opposites, right? He sees them as interconnected. You can't have one without the other. Shadows only exist because there is light, but shadow is not fighting for dominance with light. They exist in harmony. So he writes, harmony needs low and high, as progeny needs man and woman. Meaning, if you want height, you want something that's low. If you want a child, you need a man and a woman. And these are opposites. You need the masculine, the feminine. You need the high, the low. You need the big and the small. All these things work in harmony with each other. You cannot have one without the other. And that is the point that he makes, right? And for Heraclitus, that is the beauty of life. And there's a fragment which perfectly captures for me this eternal harmony between opposites. And he writes, goat cheese melted in warm wine congeals if not well stirred. And a bit of context here about the goat cheese melting. There's a drink during this time where you add goat cheese to hot wine, but you'd have to constantly stir it to properly enjoy this drink. Otherwise, the cheese will solidify and you'd just be drinking hot wine and biting cheese. The image that Heraclitus is portraying here is something that really doesn't, quote unquote, go together because they're opposites. One's liquid and one's solid, right? Cheese. But when you put solid cheese in hot wine, it melts. And for that melted cheese to stay melted, you have to constantly be stirring. And to properly enjoy this drink, you have to stir it and then drink it. Something for us who don't drink goat cheese mixed with hot wine is that of balsamic vinegar. And with balsamic vinegar, if you don't stir it, the substances separate. But to enjoy balsamic vinegar, you constantly stir it, you pour it over your salad, you eat it with the salad, and it tastes delicious. But if you don't do it, then you'll just get this separated substance pouring out. So then Heraclitus goes on to say that the whole universe, everything other than the one, right, that which permeates all reality, functions with this harmony between the opposites. So he writes, the cosmos works by harmony of tension like lyre and bow. For both the lyre and the bow, the lyre specifically is a musical instrument and the strings are under constant tension. But it is through the tension that the musical notes are created. And these strings, when played, create beautiful music. But for us to get this music, it means we have to put multiple strings in a constant state of tension. But it is in that state of tension that when the musician strums the lyre, music is created. And so with the bow, for it to work, the bowstring has to be under a constant tension. And it is only in that tension you can pull back, stretch the bowstring back and fire. And that's how the bow works. So again, it is through this tension that there's a harmony. And from this harmony, beauty is created. So he writes, from the strain of binding opposites comes harmony. And what all of this means for us reading Heraclitus and us trying to understand Heraclitus is it does quite a few things. Because he teaches that all things are in constant flux or change, there is a permanence which exists in it because everything is constantly changing. There's a constancy, right? And there's a unity that, again, takes place between the flux and the permanence. Again, to use his language here, the strain of binding opposites comes harmony. So there is this unity between the flux and the permanence. This means that the permanency that you're looking for, the permanency that we are looking for is not found in being detached, but it's actually found in this present moment, in fully being alive here and in the now and in this moment. And because that is the only thing that's real right now. And that is the only permanent thing. Each day, each hour, each minute, each second, each moment is never the same and will never be the same. So then we must do what we can to be aware of this instant, this moment, this second, this minute, this hour, this day. Right? And this gets significantly harder when we are suffering, when we are going through difficult times, when we're going through challenging times. It's most certainly, and I know this from experience, it is painful to try to remain in the moment and to appreciate the moment. But if you can persist through the pain and to remind yourself this cosmic truth that Heraclitus is saying, then you will have transcended the suffering, you will have transcended the pain. And even in the moments when you are at your highest, right, when you're getting awarded the gold medal, when you are winning in life, when you're getting that business deal done, so on and so forth, to remember that even in that state, it is impermanence. What you instead should be is completely being present in the moment and not allow yourself to be deluded by the pain or by the joy and to be pulled back and forth, up and down, but instead be even-minded. For it is in the even-mindedness that Heraclitus calls the greatest virtue. So the challenge for this week is, one, to embrace the change and the impermanence and recognize that everything is in a constant state of change and of flux. And to use this understanding to become more adaptable and less attached to this material possession, and to not fix our eyes on the outcomes, but to embrace the change, embrace the process. The second thing is what we just mentioned about being present in the moment. To understand that truly the only permanent thing is this instance, is this moment. And what this does is it helps us maintain this peace, which oftentimes gets stolen by the noise in the world, by stressful, by times of difficulty. And so being present in this moment, I think, is something we can take away from Heraclitus, and to not allow ourselves to be pulled back and forth by the opposites, but to find harmony there. And third is to seek wisdom through knowing yourself, through self-reflection. And it requires a constant daily practice, right, to strive after wisdom, to go to where she calls you, as King Solomon in the Proverbs writes, right, wear wisdom around your neck, wear it as a crown, take wisdom with you wherever you go. With that, I'll wrap. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you haven't already subscribe to Becoming Antifragile on Spotify, Apple, wherever else you're listening to. Give it a 5-star review. It helps this podcast be found by more people. And if you're not subscribed to my weekly newsletter, go to ijmakan.substack.com. The link will be in the description below. The Substack will give you a condensed version of this wisdom that we're learning. And also, if you are a paid member, then you get exclusive access to writings. And finally, I just completed my latest painting called Transcendence. You can learn more about that on my Substack. I'm also going to link that essay where I break down Transcendence. Until next week, peace.